Hello. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Real Talk Family Life. Building shatterproof families one brick at a time. We apologize for the late start this evening. We just wanted to make sure everyone was connected, and we are sure that everyone is here. We just want to encourage you to join our program, to comment in the chat, use the emojis, raise your hands, use the chat feature, etc. We want to acknowledge everyone joining us on YouTube, all our YouTube participants. And we pray for God's guidance and revelation so that there's unity on how this topic helps to build shatterproof families and the wider community. So tonight is part 2 of that topic called forgiveness. And the last time we were here, Dr. Neff ran a very good program on the process of forgiveness. You know, what are the responsibilities of the parties involved when we talk about forgiveness, the process of forgiveness itself. And tonight we have 3 panelists, 3 esteemed panelists with us, none of them strangers to the program: Pastor Joseph Griffith, Mr. David Andrew, and joining us shortly will be Miss Seneca King. I'm going to give the panelists a minute or two to introduce themselves or reintroduce themselves and to offer an opening word, phrase, comment on forgiveness. Over to you, Pastor Griffith.
Hello, good evening. It's good to be here another time. I don't consider myself so esteemed, except that I am a member of the body of Christ. So I'm just like you, struggling myself with the question of forgiveness to understand what it really is. But I don't know if I would ever be able to explain or to understand forgiveness. What I'm quite certain about is that forgiveness really is not a human thing, because I find that it is quite normal for us as human beings to want to protect ourselves. We want to revenge. We want to know that people pay for the injustices, and nobody likes feeling hurt or offended. But we have a God who has set an example. We've seen what happened on Calvary, how our Lord said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what to do." So we have that constant struggle because we're human, and I think it's natural to defend ourselves. And that is why I think forgiveness is so difficult for us as human beings. I pause.
David.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you tonight again on this platform to continue the discussion on what I consider a very, very necessary topic, the topic of forgiveness. I say necessary because as human beings, we are prone to doing things, in fact, by our very nature, the fact that we're different, we are going to rub people the wrong way, we are going to come across the wrong way, our motives may not always align. What I might see as important may not necessarily be what the sister or the brother or my partner, my wife, may see as important. And all of these things, which are natural to us as human beings, set up an ideal stage for hurting each other, being misinterpreted, being misunderstood. And needless to say, when persons are themselves even hurt and in a state of disrepair, it becomes even easier in that state to hurt others without even sometimes intending to do it that badly. And all of these make the topic extremely useful if we are going to relate well, if we are going to get along well and make the best of the human interaction that we are supposed to have. It makes this evening's topic very, very useful to be a part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And while we wait on Sister King to join us, you know, I really like what you said. In the last program, we learned that forgiveness, as Pastor Griffith said, is foreign to our nature. You would have mentioned, David, in that program that, you know, you give power to the person over our lives when we choose not to forgive, and that forgiveness itself is about liberation for the victim, and the person who we're angry with may be someone with a maladaptive perspective. And then tonight you made a point of us not being able to please everyone. So, by virtue of just being, we might offend someone. So I just, we're going to recap in the first 10 minutes or so what we would have covered last week. And I just wanted us to stay there a bit. And so my first question to the panelists about forgiveness, is it just about saying sorry and moving on? It was just a mistake? Or is it something that was damaging to a relationship that now needs to be restored? Just to clarify for our participants, is it okay to just say sorry and move on? It was just a mistake. What happens if that doesn't happen? And to what extent is unforgiveness damaging to a relationship that now needs to be restored?
If I may go, in the book of Luke, everybody know Luke 17. Earlier, I get the idea that our Lord was talking to his disciples, and he was in fact saying some very serious things to the disciples, and it made them wonder a lot. And in verse 3, Jesus says, "Take heed to yourself. If thy brother trespass against thee, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him." I want to, at this moment, highlight a few things here in this verse. We agree, first of all, that God expects us to forgive. And because that we ourselves will invariably offend somebody, we need to understand that the Bible teaches a principle about doing unto others as we have them do unto us. But in Luke 17:3, he says, rebuke them. And I understand that word to mean to rebuke them correctively. In other words, you deal with them, you approach them, you confront them in a way to put them in the right order, not to make the relationship worse, but try to have them to be aware of where he have offended you. And that is important because we oftentimes do things and we may not be aware of the magnitude of the damage that we have done. But not also the second part, Jesus said, and if he repents. And this sister, I think, is very important because it cannot be just to say, I'm sorry, I move on. And if I understand the word repent means you must show that you're really sorry. You're going to stop that lifestyle. You're going to try to make a corrective action. So it's just not forgive me or you know what I mean? And the Bible says when he does that, you forgive him. And on the other hand, we also know that I just can't just say forgive, because forgiveness, we need to understand what forgiveness is. Perhaps my brother wants to come in here.
So thank you very much. And surely I want to recap by stating probably in another way what I think forgiveness is. And I would say it's a choice or a decision by an affected individual, I'll put it simply, to eliminate anger or any negative emotion towards another person who has hurt him or her. No, it's a choice, a deliberate choice or a decision who's affected to eliminate, to get rid of anger or any negative emotions towards another person who has hurt him or her. This mental state, this change in mental state allows the person who is hurt to release himself or herself from the strong controlling emotions related to the harmful occurrence or to the hurtful occurrence. I want to put that out there so that both parts. And it's not just saying sorry, certainly not. It's not justifying the wrongdoing. So in no way is it saying, well, it's okay, what has happened. I'm turning a blind eye to it. It's not absolving the person from the responsibility that they need to face or take for it. It's not saying that the relationship must continue the same way or must be restored to the same extent. It's not saying any of those things, but it's certainly a conscious decision on the part of the person to no longer be controlled, directed by the negative emotions. And you asked, as part of the question you posed earlier, to what extent does that affect relationships? Oh man, it affects relationships immensely. Because from the very time somebody feels hurt, we go into defensive mode. We go into self-preservation mode. We go into a mode where either we recurl, like the turtle will do, to secure ourselves, and that affects communication. So think of that in the context of a life partner, a husband or a wife or a boyfriend or a girlfriend. You recurl, communication is affected, the genuineness is affected. The person then becomes unsure as to who exactly is the person I'm dealing with. Am I dealing with the shell of that individual? Am I dealing with the emotions? Am I dealing with a fake version of them? And all of these things affect the strength of the relationship. Then it can even go to the point where, apart from recurling, you can go on the offensive. Some persons, based on your personality type, you feel I'm going to go all out for them. They won't catch me with my pants down another time. I'm going to catch them first. And that tendency can be adopted by some persons with a stronger type A personality. And that affects relationships. And then you have what it does to the brain and the fact that it affects some circuits in the brain responsible for empathy. So it can cause us to become very empathetic, and not just for that relationship, but it could affect other relationships too, because you don't even want to get stung anything similarly by another person in another context. So all those are possible effects on the relationships if not handled. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. So, it's almost like y'all are reading the questions in advance. So in the previous session as well, we learned about the constituents in the process of forgiveness, whether that be exoneration, forbearance, and release. And we also learned from among the panelists that release itself may well be the greatest of the three if we had to make a singular choice on which was most important in the process of forgiveness. But then we still had some lingering questions. For example, when we speak about forgiveness, we often speak about it in terms of the person being hurt, the person who's affected, and what that person has to do to release the offender. David, I want to come back to you and then to you, Pastor Griffith. In the process of forgiveness, is there ever consideration about seeing the situation through the offender's eyes? Is that something that is possible?
Yes, it is something that is possible. And I wouldn't just say possible, but it's something that I encourage. And a while ago, I used the term empathy. Here's where you put yourself in the person's shoe. You try to feel what the person may be feeling. Now, that's hard to do when you are overwhelmed by the novelty of your own feelings and your own emotions as the recipient of a very hurtful experience. And that's why due process has to be taken in going through those feelings, because you can't get to the points about thinking about others before you think of yourself. So while it's something we encourage, in fact, we've all traveled, and the air hostess I normally use this with always say, in the unlikely event of a smoke-filled cabin, the oxygen mask will descend, attach it to your mouth first, and then attempt to give help to those around you, the dependents and all of that. And it's the same thing here. Your emotions must first be accounted for, processed. But it's useful in that process of treating with the emotions and dealing with forgiveness that you attempt to get a view. What is that other person feeling? How might he or she be feeling? I know, now that I've processed it, that I am feeling extremely angry and enraged. How might that person be feeling? And just as you begin to process that, it begins to put a balancing spin on the situation that makes it easier for you to, in the end, recognize that we're two humans here, probably on different sides of this, but it certainly makes it easier to deal with. And it's something I do recommend in terms of the forgiveness process.
Pastor Griffith.
The truth about it is that even when we try to see the other person, we might not always see them in the way that, for example, David would like them to see, because we might see that the person is really unrepentant, and it is when we get that occurring that we can find it so difficult to deal with it. But I quite agree that it's important, because I said earlier that we're not always aware that we actually offended, or that we offended to this degree. And I think that is why it's extremely important for us to approach these people directly and let them know, listen to me, this is how I felt, or how you have hurt me in the process. So yes, it is important that we confront, and that we also see it from the other person's perspective. But we cannot give up, because it's a process.
Fantastic.
Sasha.
Yes, go ahead.
I mean, one example comes pretty strongly to mind. Now, you have sometimes children whose parents are not as present in their lives. Mm-hmm. A daughter whose mother probably left her up for adoption, and sometimes and they get bitter, and they probably never even take the time of day to think, what was my mother thinking? What was my mother going through during that period? And so they live feeding their minds with their own self-talk, and the anger keeps being nurtured, and the hate festers, and all of these things. And it's only if you get them to a place, if you walk them through, just think about what's been happening to your mother. And once they begin to do that, they begin to see the situation from a whole new perspective that allows them a fresh approach and an ease to accepting and to forgiving and all the good things that come with it. Yeah.
And I want to go back to something you said earlier as well, David, related to, that empathy you're speaking about, and seeing the offense through the offender's eyes, and that being so difficult. You said that hurt, when somebody gets hurt, it leads to self-preservation, and it affects other people's relationships. And I think about a male or female who might have been in one situation, and you see all these memes about bringing baggage into another relationship, whether that's with a mate or spouse, or even a new friendship. So in terms of unforgiveness, right? Well, does unforgiveness, I should say, really protect us as a defense or coping mechanism? Because I think there's a wide perception that if you hold that grudge, then it's going to protect you against future hurts. But as you've rightly said, unless we're willing to empathize with the offender, etc., we haven't really released. So what do you say to people who say, no, if I hold it, it means nobody's going to be able to hold me again? Is unforgiveness really a defense coping mechanism, or an adequate defense or coping mechanism? What would you offer as an alternative?
Right. So, I mean, a coping mechanism is a natural human response to overloads in our system. So when the body feels psychologically overloaded, in fact, even physically, there are things that the body can do, and psychologically, there are a number of them. You might collapse, you might black out, some people might say. Some people intellectualize the matter and trivialize it. Some people project it onto other people. So you have all of these things. Now, forgiveness, if you see it in the immediate, telling yourself you're really angry and you can't forgive this person might just prevent you from engaging the full voltage and the full severity of the situation. But if you remember that forgiveness is a choice, And it's not something that I say you have to do right here, right now, while you're all emotional. So defense mechanisms come in at the spur of the moment. Forgiveness is not one such thing. Forgiveness is something that is duly processed. And so I'm not sure I would say it is an effective defense mechanism, because forgiveness itself doesn't have to respond as soon as the defense mechanism kicks in, which is a self-preservation, naturally occurring body response to preserve you from overexposure, right? Forgiveness, though, is a choice. So it's not something that naturally kicks in. And does it, is it really going to benefit you? Does it protect you? While people might think so, I say no, it doesn't. It doesn't protect you psychologically, because the research indicates that it increases your vulnerability to conditions like anxiety, panic attacks, nervousness. Even medically, it increases your susceptibility to high blood pressure and to having acidic body pHs, which set a good body tone for ulcers and for cancers and for migraines. And if you go to explain how that happens, because when you are put under any kind of threat, be it real or perceived, the body's natural system kicks into a fight or flight mode. And you hear that a lot in psychological settings. But with that comes hypersensitivity. It comes, and if you just look at hypersensitivity, when that kicks in, it kicks out reason. Because you're preparing either to fight or to flee. And so even when there is something that is not an obvious threat, like something that's bothering you, something that's unforgiven, a challenge that you're facing, those conditions prevail, and it still remains the hypersensitivity. The hormones get secreted, the toxicity level in the body increases. The body's prepared for action that isn't there, that's not forthcoming. And so over a period of time, you're actually poisoning your system. You're actually creating system overload, self-defeating situations. And so is it helpful to maintain a posture of unforgiveness? No, you are self-imprisoning and looking for an answer somewhere and trying to protect yourself while you lock yourself in prison. I mean, it's just not helpful, medically, psychologically, and otherwise.
Pastor Griffith, do you want to join in, or should we go to?
Yeah, we are in fact hurting ourselves when we continue to carry that grudge or continue to hurt. And as we said earlier, the very definition of forgiveness means to let bygones be bygones. And it does not mean that we are necessarily making, like, we're not saying to people, like, for Jesus said, behold, I send you forth as sheep among wolves. Be therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Yes, I think that we need to be discerning as to people's behavior. There are some people who are just prone to taking advantage, etc., etc. And I think that as believers, we need to be aware of these. But also what is extremely important is that, as I said earlier, forgiveness is not part of our human nature. But the more we work towards the ability to forgive, I think the more Christ-like character we tend to develop. And for believers especially, I think we are more encouraged as we strive to adapt the spirit of Christ and be more Christ-like. So it is good for us to practice it, even though we realize it is not part of our nature.
Thank you, gentlemen. So one of the questions from YouTube, we invite every participant to comment in the chat or drop your comments in the chat so we can share and so that everyone can benefit from it. One of the questions from the chat, how do you go about forgiving when you perceive the offender as benefiting from the offense committed against you as the victim? Sometimes forgiveness takes more than human effort, as Pastor Griffith just said, it's foreign to us. So I'm going to repeat, how do you go about forgiving when you perceive the offender as benefiting from the offense against you as the victim?
Well, the truth is, you might perceive the offender is benefiting from your act of forgiving. If you think the offender has benefited from the action against you, probably by stealing or probably property or whatever it is, I could see that. But still, when you hold the act or his act against him, you are not doing him an issue as much as you're doing yourself. So I think the perception is wrong that the person has already benefited, or they continue to benefit when you forgive them. Because when you forgive them, you firstly and more so free yourself. You firstly and more so preserve yourself. And that is the biggest benefit. And it frees you to be able to react with that person however you want. It frees you from the medical complaints. It frees you from the psychological barrier and imprisonment that you've put yourself in. So I think the perception needs to be changed. And I think it was emphasized, it's a choice that the person makes. And it's more so for you as the forgiver than for the person, the forgivee, if I should say that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Pastor.
Can I give
Yeah,
that
we keep emphasizing that it is for us in the first instance. But somewhere in scripture, the Bible said I think in Acts 17, verse 30, and the times of this ignorance God winked at. And somewhere else, scripture says that we ought not to want to render evil for evil, somewhere in Romans. And God says straight, God, I will avenge, saith the Lord. So yes, people will invariably take things from us. They will benefit from using us and offending us. Some people, they're just like that. And there's some things that we can get back. But I don't know, like if someone stole something from me, there may be a chance I may be able to go in the house or get the police and get back my thing, whether I do charges or not, I might be able to get it back. But when somebody offend me by telling me that I'm ugly, now that is nothing I can get back. I will probably always remember that they hurt me, but and they like doing it. But my point to remain is I must let bygones be gone, as we keep saying, because it is about me protecting myself. And when I realized the Bible said, when God said, leave it to me, vengeance is mine. So sometimes we need to come to that spiritual position to know that there's some things that are definitely too much for us. And all that we can do is say, God, I hand in this over to you. Only what we have sometimes.
Yeah, and Pastor Griffith, earlier you said that we should tell the offender how they've hurt us. That may not always be possible. And one of the critical points made in the last program was that the process of forgiveness is not specific to that present situation, right?
Yes.
That you restore the offender and give them the opportunity to do it again. So it teaches us what we should do if that situation happens again. But in that vein, and knowing that forgiveness is a deliberate choice, and we may not always make that correct choice, do we keep score, especially when we're triggered or reminded of those offenses? And how important is it really in finding that person who did us wrong and tell them we've forgiven them, so to speak? Should we always do it, or is what David recommended in the last program of writing it out or verbalizing it enough? So just to be clear, one of the critical points is that forgiveness, the process, is a deliberate choice, but sometimes we keep score, especially when we're triggered or reminded of the offense. Do we always have to find the offender and say, this is how you've hurt me, but I've forgiven you? Or is writing it out and verbalizing it, as suggested in the last program, enough?
Well, seeking out, let me start with seeking out. David may consciously aware that he did me some evil, all right? And perhaps I might want to go and say, David, I know you did so and so, but I want to let you know that I ain't want to against you no more. So you're going to be frightened to come and ask me for drink of water, or don't feel that I can let stand up and let the rain wet here and I pass in my car. I can get a lift. I have forgiven you, so let me move on. I see you being shunning me, but let me move on. That is quite all right. But Michelle could have done evil to me, whatever it was, and Michelle lives overseas. I will probably never see Michelle. I don't need to have any desire, in my opinion, to run after her. What I need is, God, you have forgiven me, and I have forgiven her. Or even if it only means I am no longer taking that responsibility upon myself. I'm no longer going to affect any pain on myself. I am going to hand that over. And we do not keep score. Keeping score in my mind is the same as holding grudge. When the John the Baptist spoke about the sin of Herod and Herodias, it is clear that Herodias had this thing always for him. She had this being the bonnet, that's the word, always there for him. So the first opportunity she got, she acted. And that is sufficient to tell us that when we store up grudges, we tend to act violently or destructively, or we ourselves tend to commit sin. And then we offend God. So how better are we? We want to get back at Suzanne for offending us, but now we're going to be offending God. We sin. So we don't keep score. No, we can't. I pause.
David, you want to comment or should we move on?
But no, I'd be happy to comment. Now, I agree with you, Pastor Griffith, but I want to emphasize, if it's possible to verbalize, if it's possible to meet the person, that is always a best fit in my mind, except it's life-threatening, which might mean the timing isn't right and the other issues surrounding it may not facilitate it at the moment. But if it's possible at all, then that's always best, because it empowers you. It strengthens you as an individual. Think of people who unfortunately got raped or something of that sort. And they tell you the time they are able to get close to that person and look them in the eye and say, what you did was despicable. It's something that I don't stand for. You shouldn't have done this. That brings a certain degree of strength to the person, even in their pain, that allows them, that facilitates the healing. So that I call it confrontation because but that verbalizing face to face is always best when possible. If it's not possible, like Pastor Griffith alluded to, then writing, there are some empty chair exercises, all of these things help, because what they do is that they help you to find ventilation for the same pent-up emotions and feelings that the person will be well served with if they get them out. Just wanted to add that.
Fantastic. And you jumped right into the next question, which was about carefrontation. That's what we wanted to go back to and recap. Because I love how you choose carefrontation as opposed to confrontation, and the connotations between the two just seem vastly different and, on two ends of the spectrum. So I was going to ask you for a practical example of carefrontation and how that might work with someone who might not want to acknowledge their wrongdoing, or in a situation where you're trying to minimize carefrontation. Is the example that you've given quite the same, or is it different for someone who does not want to acknowledge their wrongdoing, but you still need to, this is what you've done, whether or not you accept it, and this is how I feel, but yet I've forgiven you?
Right. So there are a couple of key things about carefronting that I want to point out, because from what it is to the language used, there are some key differences. So confrontation is not about the other party being willing to acknowledge his or her wrong. In fact, forgiveness is not even about that either. Forgiveness for the person who chooses to exercise it is not about the other party being willing to acknowledge his or her wrong. No, we hope that happens in the process. for reciprocity. But if the other person isn't willing, it doesn't stop me from doing it anyway, right? But I'm saying in the case of confrontation, it's about the offended person owning and respectfully expressing his or her feelings. Note I say owning and respectfully expressing it, and assertively and asserting what he would like to see happen, what he or she would like to see happen. So you own it and you express it. It's all about you expressing about self, how self feels when particular things happen. A key element in that, or a very useful tool in using that modality, is the use of I statements. So most times, even a while ago, you alluded to, you made a statement, the person needs to know that this is how they've hurt me and this is what, but confronting doesn't even use that kind of language. It centers on, these are my feelings when, so I say, I feel really belittled when ABC happens, and that ABC that we're talking about here must be a statement of fact. So I feel very belittled when on 3 occasions I call the phone that belongs to my wife or that belongs to my husband or that belongs to, and I get no answer, right? Because I give good attention to all calls that come from the people who are dearest to me. I would like it very much if when I'm called or when I call the people I care about more than once, 3 times, 4 times, at the very least, I can get a return call within a certain period, a few days or whatever. So you notice in all of that, it didn't say, you refused to answer my call, you ignored me. It didn't say you, but it said how I felt, why I felt so. And here is where people need to be very careful, because there's a natural tendency to say, you've done this, you stole my bag, you did, but it's different in that you're saying, I felt intruded upon when my property was entered into and robbed. And the person has to come to their own conclusion. But, you know, I was the doer of that. No, you didn't say that to them. So it makes it easier for them to accept. It makes it easier for them to come to the realization that really that was me. And what you want is to create an atmosphere where the person is better prepared and more open to listening and to hearing and understanding that they really have caused you to hurt, or they've done some things that left you feeling hurt. And so using that confrontation model with the language very I-centered, without aggression, without blame, helps persons to be a lot more accepting. So you ask for example. Let me talk about a son who is bitter against his father. I think I alluded to one such example already. Let me see how I could frame a confrontation response using the I statements. So this son doesn't want to, he's angry against his father because he feels his father isn't there, his father is absent, and his father doesn't support in times when he needs him most. So he could say, Dad, I want to share with you that I've been feeling very devalued and angry lately. I have been feeling devalued and angry lately. I felt angry when my dad is not present at my PTA meetings, or my dad has not been present at any PTA meeting for the entire term. Now, when you examine that, is that a statement of fact? It must be uncontestable. It mustn't say, when you didn't come to the PTA, or when you ignore all my, or you treat me like a dog or left over or whatever it is. It's not suggesting what his interpretation is. It's a statement of fact. And he said, I felt angry when my dad is not present, or I felt devalued, sorry, when my father does not attend my graduation ceremony, but goes to a football match. Now, if a father hears that, and he hears that a son feels devalued on the grounds that his father, I know he doesn't say you, his father hasn't come to his graduation, the average rational thinking person gets a little prick somewhere inside that leaves them, you know, wanting to chide themselves quietly without somebody saying, you need to do that. And then he can go on to say, I would like it very much if I could enjoy a growing father-son relationship with the man I look up to, my father. Something like that sets a very confrontational stage for forgiveness and for dealing with those challenges.
Forgiveness sounds like a lot of work, you know, and confrontation even much more. So,
Yes,
Pastor
it is.
Griffith, how do we learn a skill like this? Is it about practice and repetition? Is it just you pray for it one night and you hope that through osmosis you get it through the pillow? This just sounds like a lot of work. How
It
do we
is.
learn a skill like this, and is it
It is.
beneficial?
It is. I remember I was not in the commercial format school. We had technical science and arts. I was in the arts. And I therefore never learned how to type. But one day when I was by the school, I discovered I had to submit my work typed, double space, and all that kind of thing. And I couldn't afford to pay all that money to get my work done. And every evening, I got an old typewriter, someone loaned me, manual typewriter, and I went home and practice. Now I can actually close my eyes with all my fingers and almost know when I miss the wrong key. All right. And I got there over time. And I have come to learn at my age that a lot of things that I've experienced in my life when I was younger may not have been good. There are things that I would probably do differently. There are things that I would have fought against. I would have been angry all about. And today, it makes me understand how to avoid doing these things. And I have come to learn what people mean when they say that they ask for experience. And I'm recognizing how experience is such a wonderful, I don't know. So even if we keep on, I will say, well, there it goes, oh Lord, I made a mistake again, and I will try again. And then eventually you realize, you know what? I'm no longer thinking so hard not to do it, like not to worry or not to commit that error or whatever, or not to make myself so vulnerable. I'm not that, I'm just becoming wiser, right? So I'm saying that it is over time something, and all we need to do is keep doing it. And one day we will arrive without realizing that we have arrived.
Great. So before we move on, we have a comment in the Zoom chat. What a beautiful model. And I assume he's speaking about confrontation. It definitely takes patience and skill with compassion. And so we have a question for the panelists. Sister King, welcome. If you don't mind, I want to come to you on this one.
Thank you.
What happens when the person or the wrongdoer refuses to acknowledge your feeling or believes that you are overreacting and so continues to trigger you? How do you deal with forgiveness then?
First of all, I would like to say that forgiveness is a choice, and forgiveness is really for the offended person. It frees you, how do I want to say it? It gives you back some measure of control of an out of control situation. So a lot of people think that forgiveness is to let the offender off the hook, but truly forgiveness is to help the offended to come to healing and to regain some measure of control over their lives. So having said that, what happens when someone refuses to acknowledge that they have offended you? What do you do? My suggestion would be continue to forgive them. They may not acknowledge that they've done you wrong, but remember that the forgiveness is for you. It is to set you free. I think, as I said before in my recorded introduction, Nelson Mandela said to someone who asked him how he was able to forgive those who had lied about him and caused him to be in prison. He said, if I don't forgive them, I continue to be imprisoned by them. And remember, I think Bob Marley had a line in a song that I liked when he said, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. If you don't forgive, you continue to be enslaved by that person. So even though the person has not acknowledged that they've offended you, the best thing you can do for yourself is to forgive them and move on. And maybe over time, they will come to see that they have hurt you and have offended you. I'd also like to refer to another key philosophy, I guess you could say, of life for me is that Eleanor Roosevelt once said that insults are taken, not given. So even though a person may not acknowledge that they have hurt you, you still have that you have that control of the situation that you can choose to forgive them and behave in a manner as if they have not offended you. I know it sounds more difficult to do than it probably is. And in some cases, it is difficult. But remember this, a person can die without ever having acknowledged that they have hurt you. Will you continue to allow them, even from the grave, to control you and your life? No, the best thing to do is to forgive them and move on.
So we keep hearing forgiveness is a choice. We've heard that a lot of times. We're hearing about empathy. It's not a natural thing, so it does take work. When you forgive the offender, you free yourself. When we hold grudges, we act or sin against God. And I think that's an important message to take. And it might actually lead to us acting on revenge or acting out revenge. Forgiveness helps or heals the offended, and we should continue to forgive. And I like what you ended with, Sister King, offense is taken, it's not given. Excuse me. So I have another question, simple one. In the process of forgiveness, does time heal all wounds?
Several years ago, I remember I was at work and I was being transferred from one department into another department that I was not so happy about. And an older gentleman, father figure, he's dead now. He looks to me and he said, Joseph, time is a healer. Now, I know I've heard people say opposite to that it is not so, all right? But I think what it really means and what it meant to me was, don't worry, Joseph. At this moment, you are hurting. In other words, most of us, I think, can identify where we were probably had a relationship, girlfriend, boyfriend, that, especially when we were young at school, probably, that went sour. And we felt as though our entire world has died. And even though sometimes we might still remember it, I'm quite certain we are eating, we are drinking, we are happy, we are probably even overweight now, all right? So they don't have that thing hanging over us anymore. So in that sense, just like grieving, I don't know if we ever forget our loved ones who have died. I don't know if we ever really stop grieving. I do not know, right? I say, and I've lost a daughter now, and I think that if I sit down and talk somewhat about her, perhaps a tear might drop. And I say to people, it is just about learning to cope, learning to deal with it. learning to put it into perspective. And I say to people or to my wife, look, when my time comes and I die, just let me go, because I now have to have a conversation with my daughter. Let me go. So I'm saying that time heals in the sense that over time, the effects of that bad thing experience, we can learn to deal with. That's how I see it. I pause.
Now, if I should chime in, Dr. Sutherland, I want to share, I want to take the opposite road. I don't think time, while I appreciate and understand the perspective that Pastor Gifford shares, and I agree with it, in fact. In another sense, I want to say that time is not time that heals the wounds, but it's what we do in time that heals the wounds. Because time alone can cause some wounds to decay, to get worse, and to kill us if we don't do the right things. Time alone could allow for some things to actually heal poorly and maladaptively. It's like a broken finger, a broken bone, and if it's not set properly from the onset, it might cure, but it might cure defectively. And so time could serve to cement and crystallize something that's maladaptive if we do not do the right thing. So yes, I agree. Time has an element to play, but more critical is what we do in time that helps the effect of time to have its due and rightful effect on the situation.
And I agree with David's perspective. That is exactly how I feel, that it is what you do with time. And one of the things that I have learned in my own personal life is that if you continue to rehearse the wrong that has been done, it takes a much longer time to get over that hurt and to forgive and move on. So one of the things is to stop rehearsing the wrong. There is a period of time when, you know, a wrong has first been committed that you tend to talk about it a lot. And I think that in itself is cathartic. But if you carry that into overdrive, where you are talking about it 24/7 and 365 days a year, you will never get over that feeling of being a victim and of being wronged. So it is learning to cope, dealing, using time to engage in behaviors that help you to heal and to forgive and to move on.
Thank you. So before we go to the scenarios, there's another question in the chat concerning carefrontation. The question is, how do I discern the timing when to bring up, I guess, the situation to the person, especially when you live with them, like your spouse? I sometimes struggle with waiting too long, and I find myself repeating the offense when I should have spoken to the person. I do not want to be premature in my approach. So again, concerning carefrontation, how do I discern the timing when to bring it up to the person, especially when you live with them, for example, your spouse? And the person says, I sometimes struggle with waiting too long and I find myself repeating the offense when I should have spoken to them. I don't want to be premature in my approach. What advice can you offer? David, I'll start with you.
Right, no problem. So from the onset, there are a couple of things you'd want to avoid. As in any other interpersonal situation, interrelational situation, you want to avoid poor timing. And you'd know poor timing if the emotions are too high, because once emotions are too high, that process we're talking about is a process that hinges heavily on really well managed emotions and rational thought and all of that. Now, when emotions are high, like something has just happened, it's never a good time to try to confront, because the reason and the rational thought that normally can go into situations, that is bypassed. And that's a natural neurological process as well. So that tends to be bypassed, and we get into that hypersensitive mode. So we say things we don't mean, we do things and all of that, and that could aggravate the already bad situation. So check for your emotions. Are my emotions in a good place? Are my thoughts clear? Am I very clear on my idea as to exactly what the problem is? Do I have those things clearly mapped out? If you don't have them yet, it's probably not a good time, because you're just probably going to raise a hornet's nest and not be able to deal with it well. And it could come across as you're accusing, because you don't have the points, you don't have the problem carefully mapped out. And then what of your partner's emotions? Is that high? Is it the right place? Is it a place that opens you to public scrutiny? Is it private? So all of these factors, like in any other are the distractors. All of these interpersonal communication barriers we probably would need to look at and make sure we are clear in our messaging, what we have in mind to say, so that when we do raise the issue, we can feel psychologically safe, and so too our partner. That's a big thing, the psychological safety of the partners involved as you begin to address it. If you could feel satisfied that your thoughts are together, your emotions are in a good place with good intentions, and you don't have many barriers, it's probably a good time.
Yeah, before the other panelists chime in, I always remember when we were doing lay counseling, the instructor would say one of the things she used with her husband was she would set an appointment. And, everybody laughed, but it's so important that when you want to address something, David, as you've said, Mr. Andrew, you don't just, fly off the handle, but you say, I want to speak to you about X, Y, and Z, full stop, just the title. Can I speak to you about X, Y, and Z? Are you available at 7 p.m. tonight when the kids are asleep for us to have a conversation? That way, you've already set up the atmosphere, as you've alluded to. It's just the two of y'all speaking about this situation and working through it. And not just in forgiveness, but in anything that might be confrontational. You want to adopt that carefrontational approach. You want to say, let's deal with this when nobody's around, when we can actually hash out the situation. And even when you may not have come to a solution, you set an appointment for another time to say, can we pick this up at X date? And so it gives you time, as you said, David, to go over what it is you want to say, not having those you statements, and not being overly emotive about the situation. I see you want to say something else. And
yes, just to piggyback on what you said, to make it even better, apart from setting the time,
Sure.
you open it to the person and say, listen, I'd be happy if we can talk about this. It's really important to me. Tell me a time when it suits you best. So it gets even better, so that they get a chance to have an input in setting the time. I pretty much like that.
Sister King, Pastor Griffith.
I think of myself and others in the teaching profession. When there is a problem that needs to be corrected, you want to address that problem as soon as possible. You don't want to let a problem get worse and then not deal with it at all, or not deal with it at all, I should say. You think of a doctor and a patient relationship. When the doctor has done his tests, et cetera, and has come to a diagnosis, he doesn't want to delay that diagnosis for good reasons. He wants to deal with that problem, because if the problem can be corrected in the early stages, it is far better for the patient than to wait until the problem gets worse. So in short, what I'm saying is that while I agree with David that timing is very important and one has to be sensitive about the emotions involved and so forth, we must not let that problem run unchecked for too long. And I think this is why God gives us this injunction in his word, let not the sun go down on your wrath. because some people can use time as an avoidance technique. You know, I don't have time to deal with it today. And tomorrow, another scenario crops up where we don't have time to discuss it. And it keeps being put back and put back, postponed and postponed. Procrastination steps in, and the problem is never dealt with until it comes up again. And then it's like a volcano, because then you hear, this is the same thing you did last week or last month or whatever, instead of dealing with the immediate problem of today. So while it is good that you give yourselves time for the emotions to be dealt with, and harness in a way that would make discussion of the problem, more palatable. You cannot use that as an avoidance technique. And you see this even with court cases. When somebody who has been accused of a particular crime, they're let out on bail and they walk around for years before the case is actually called, and so forth and so on. It leaves a lot of bad feelings, between the parties that are involved, because the wrong has gone unchecked for too long. So timing is important, but one must not use time as, in procrastination to avoid dealing with the problem. That would be my suggestion. Not use time as procrastination.
You both have spoken effectively to the issue, and we acknowledge the problem of, let me call it, the crime of passion. We get angry and then we do so and so. One gentleman years ago said that you do not speak to your wife the way you speak to your girlfriend. That is, you tell her all bad things and then you expect to go back home and live with her. You do not do that. Somebody says you don't embarrass your husband, I guess, spouse in public. So yes, we quite agree that because these are human beings, our existence is all about relationships. It is about relationship with God and relationship with people around us. Even if we don't have that intimate relationship, it is, if I don't have a reasonably good relationship, my neighbor will pass me dying and don't help me, or see somebody enter my house and don't say anything. So essentially, it's all about relationships. So anything that undermines relationship, even if it offends me, I need to say, look, David, our relationship is threatened by what you did yesterday. The Bible says, because judgment is not speedily executed, my words paraphrasing, man, when you do not immediately deal with a crime, people tend to continue or to get worse because they believe that you didn't pay attention to it. So I quite agree that we need to be careful not to allow these things to go so long. And remember the doctor who said sometimes love not has to be tough. Confront, excuse me, you have done this 100 times and I ain't going the 101 time. I pause.
Thank you so much. So again, continue to drop your questions and comments in the chat so that we can address the panelists. So it's that time for forgiveness scenarios. And of course, we've spoken about the theoretical, and we could not leave part 2 of forgiveness without bringing some real life situations, some hypothetical, some real, and asking our panelists, how does forgiveness work in these scenarios? And so the first scenario, I think I have forgiven my husband for his infidelity, but after 3 weeks, I still feel numb when he wants to be intimate with me. Do I feel this way because I have not truly forgiven him?
So let me
I'm not even going to call a name.
So let me shoot. Now, I think this is a good opportunity for us to begin to strike a balance between understanding the human makeup and this whole process of forgiveness. Because the human makeup is such that even if, as we rightly keep emphasizing, forgiveness is a choice and it's an act of our will. I dare say it's an act of our will that we do. And even when we do that and we set up the mental stage for that to happen, there is a physiological process associated with the very thing that triggers the action. So any kind of intimate, if you said the situation said that your husband, the husband cheated or whatever it is, was unfaithful. So anything that has to do with intimacy sexually will begin to trigger the same hormones, the same emotions that were there at the very time you learned of it. And 3 weeks is a short period of time. Remember, we were talking about time a while ago. And even if you committed to forgiving, even if you've discussed it and you've confronted on it, and you've committed that, listen, honey, I'm forgiving you. For some period of time, whenever you approach that zone, the hormones are going to secrete the same kind of feelings and you could become overwhelmed by it. You could feel numb. And it's not that you have not forgiven. It's just your physiological processes being triggered because you enter a similar zone to the zone you've been affected in. Here is where you allow time to give us the opportunity to have our will and our choice to forgive, to override the naturally occurring triggers over time.
And I think that because in this case, the husband is very much aware of the offense that he have committed. And I don't know if we have spoken sufficiently about the responsibility of the person who did the offending. All right. And the husband must really, I say must. I don't know if we ever get there, but the offender must understand that he or she did something that was wrong. And it has a cost. You know what I mean? And part of the cost, perhaps you can say as a damage, the damage that I have done to my marriage is that it is difficult for my wife to have a relationship, intimacy with me again. And this is part of the cost of what I did. And therefore, would that such persons can understand that it is wrong to blame the person because, and I said in another context, we can cause things, meaning that not that the person who did it ain't wrong, but we could have caused them to do it. And therefore, if they can get punished for doing their wrong, to what extent did we play a part in it? So I'm saying that the sister would still remember, like the brother said, it's going to take some time to overcome it. And I wish that those who offend would understand that they give reason for it to happen, and they must find ways to help that healing process.
I quite agree, and I would add that especially in relationships where there's, that intimacy between like husband and wife, one must realize that even if children are involved and the children know, there's also a wider extension, if we could say, of the process of healing and restoration. And I hope we will address restoration a little later in the program because that's very important. Some people feel that once the words "I am sorry" are spoken, that then immediately they must be restored to the position that the original position they had. But unfortunately, relationships and emotions don't work that way. You can't turn emotions on and off like a tap. And therefore, when emotions have been damaged due to infidelity, it takes time. It's like a wound that is healing. The wound will heal, given the right attention, the right medical attention over time. That wound will heal. But that wound doesn't heal immediately. It takes the nurse or the doctor attending to that wound on a daily basis, changing the dressings, putting on the right ointments, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at damaged relationships, like a wound that has to be cared for, then one would recognize that the offender should recognize that that wound cannot heal overnight, and and that offender must be willing to apply the right ointment and do the right care to repair the damage that has been done before that person can open up and be, their intimate self with you again. And that takes time.
Thank you. One of the comments on YouTube is that whether it is physical or emotional wounds, healing takes time, and that process is different for each person. Thank you for that comment, and that is so very true. Our scenario is obviously a general. And so, Sister King, you talk about the whole process of restoration. So how about this scenario and perhaps the role or an example of how restoration works? Having forgiven my cheating husband, should I establish a written agreement with him that identifies the consequences of engaging in similar activities in future? Do we sign an agreement after I've forgiven you? Or do I restore you and to the position where you're given the opportunity to do it again? Is this 70 times 7?
Yes.
I don't know if a written agreement, is the end all and be all of it. But what I would say is that restoration is a process. And in case of infidelity, I think restoration has to include both parties sitting down with perhaps a neutral person, a counselor. And I would hope for Christians, they would look for a Christian counselor, and working through what caused them to get to that point in the first place, and seeking to address how can we, put up the correct barriers to make sure that this does not repeat itself. Because I'm sure we all know of situations where unfaithful spouses continue to be unfaithful because there's an underlying problem that they haven't dealt with. And so they just repeat the offense again and again and expect the hurt spouse, the offended spouse, to keep forgiving 70 times 7. And not paying respect to their emotions and to the collateral damage that is done, as I said, if children are in the home. Because those repeat offenses hurt the children a lot as well, and can cause damage to those children for life. So a spouse who is unfaithful has got to be able to come to the point where they recognize that unfaithfulness is not an isolated event, but it has a ripple effect in the pond, and it affects those in the immediate family, those in the immediate household, and it has a wider ripple effect to the friends and the relations that and interactions with others that emanate from that unit, that family. So certainly restoration takes time, and it's not an overnight thing, and it's not, oh, I forgive you, let's move on. It doesn't work that way. And any persons who are, in that situation, I would strongly, strongly suggest that you seek outside help.
Okay. It is just under 15 minutes left in the program. Can you believe it? We're almost close to the end already. And so we have a few more scenarios that we want to get to. So I'm going to give each panelist one scenario. And then perhaps at the end, we can weigh in generally on forgiveness. So Pastor Griffith, this is your scenario. I'm going to give each of you, and then we'll go ahead. My 17-year-old daughter was raped by her stepfather, who's 21 years older than she is. He will be released from prison for his crime in a couple of months. My daughter is now married. We have forgiven this man and moved on with our lives. So again, when you speak of restoration in the context of forgiveness, I'm bothered. I never divorced my husband, but there's no way I can restore him to that position of husband. There is no way I can ever sleep in a bed with this man. Please explain what you mean by restoration in my situation. Got it? Yeah? Okay. Before you respond, I'm going to go to David. David, your scenario is, where do parents draw the line between forgiveness and discipline of their children? Sounds simple, but we know it's not. Sister King, my job is to supervise 3 female cashiers. This entails ensuring that their cash is balanced at the end of each day. 2 months ago, one of the cashiers was short by $320. She admitted a loan shark approached her and demanded payment, which she did not have in her possession. I counseled her, and to avoid a report being placed on her file, I went to the ATM, withdrew the money, and gave it to her so she can balance her cash. I told my supervisor about the incident and asked him to have an eye on her. Yesterday, she was in a similar situation. This time, the amount was over $900. This time, her reason for the shortage was shocking. Pay the amount for me and I can give you the reward of your life. I wrote her up. My supervisor was asked to review the cash reconciliation. This time, her cash balance, and he received a report that I was making life difficult for her because she had refused my unsolicited sexual advances. Where does forgiveness start with a person like this? So we'll take those 3. Pastor Griffith, I'm coming to you. How do I restore?
Infidelity is always a problem. And when I discovered that you interfere my daughter, oh dear. I mean, the Bible said that we ought not to take a woman and her sister too. Furthermore, your stepmother, etc., etc. So I would admit, first of all, that the sister is in a weird, hard place. That she continued in the marriage still and then divorced, I cannot explain, except to suggest that it just shows how complicated the whole matter is. But I'm particularly glad that Sister King, and then you come back here, raise the issue of restoration, because I do not know that we could properly have completed this without discussing the 3 big R's I find in the whole process. I say retribution, and by that, I'm talking about how I want to get back at the person for what they have done me. Then the issue of restoration, whether we can get back together or mend the relationship that has been broken, and restitution. Now, I'm not trying to put them in any kind of order, but if you look through the Old Testament, the Bible specifically say, look, if a man carry a cow, he got to get back 2 or 3 or 4 more cows. So the idea of restitution also seems to go along with justice. And the whole idea of when I'm offended, the person must pay the price. In the case of the husband, and I dare not touch whether she continued to be married to the person or not, or whatever, but what I'm concerned about with, to what extent is she really being feared? And to what extent should she continue punishing this man? All right. He was punished because he went to prison. And was justice done or not? how much is enough, right? So all I would say at this stage, I know it's quite difficult and I don't know everything, but I would say that she needs to ask herself, how much punishment does she expect to inflict on this person? And in fact, is she not also inflicting punishment on herself? I don't know if I help, but that's why you're off at this moment.
Thank you, Brother Andrew. Unmute your mic.
Yes, sorry about that. Thank you. Where do parents draw the line in relation to forgiveness and discipline of their children? So I'm taking it that the forgiveness that is meant here is that of pardon, where parents seek to pardon their children as opposed to discipline. Well, and I don't even want to say as opposed to, because in my mind, even punishment is a part or can be a part of discipline. I like to see discipline as all of the strategies that we use to teach people to get people to behave voluntarily in a particular way. And that might mean teaching, it might mean showing, it might mean modeling, it might mean demonstrating, it might mean helping, it might mean punishing, it might mean forgiving too, or pardoning from time to time. So I see forgiveness as probably one of those things inside the whole battery of the tools that parents can use in the disciplinary process. At some points, it becomes useful, and it can be very useful if used as a teaching tool. So yes, you don't just pardon blindly, but they know why you pardon. They know on what circumstances, on what grounds, and then you set expectations for the next time. There may be a time when you choose not to pardon, and that's quite fine too. So I think it's a balancing act, but I think there is a good place for forgiveness as an element of discipline, as a teaching tool, as a modeling implement in the disciplinary process. But it doesn't go against discipline. It's part of the whole process, I would suggest. And there is a place for it, even to the point where, and I'm not a stickler for, I mean, lots of us in Christian circles, we talk a lot about sparing the rod and spoiling the child. And sometimes there are huge discussions about that. And I do believe, even from a psychological point of view, there are the times when some degree of corporal punishment can be used, particularly if it's geared at much smaller children. And here, let me play that carefully, because it's less useful as you get bigger, one, from a psychological and developmental point of view. But two, the purpose for using it must be to curb or to stop with immediacy a highly threatening behavior that has the potential to do catastrophic damage if you leave it to its natural course. What do I mean? So a child who wants to pull the hot pot of water down needs a slap on the hand quickly to learn that that can't happen, because you don't want him or her to get the natural consequence of a hot pot of oil or water bathing him down, to understand, don't do that again. You know, because the law of natural consequence will be too costly. So that might work there. But once reason and all of those things are involved, even that fades as a highly useful tool in my mind, as much as there is room for it. And I think the rod here is more indicative of all of the disciplinary strategies and approaches that we use. So yes, I would rest.
Addressing my scenario, first I would want to say this, and I'm saying, saying this loud and clear to all those who are managers of human resources in their various workplaces. Usually companies have very clear rules and regulations that govern, the interactions of their various employees. And it would do you well to follow those rules and regulations closely, especially in today's age, because as you will hear in the news over and over again, there are so many different forms of sexual harassment that can threaten you in a workplace. And you want to make sure that you're always going above board and not leaving any shadow of doubt, any cloud hanging over your head as to, anybody accusing you of being accusing you of sexual harassment in the workplace. So in this scenario, the supervisor tried to be helpful to the employee who was caught stealing. And he sought to do that by personally giving them a personal gift or loan or whatever, and then not writing it up. And I think that's where he went wrong. I think even though he sought to help the person, pardon the person, he should have had that written in his company notes somewhere. And he could put it in such a way that, okay, this problem was dealt with. I understood why the person did X, Y, Z, and this is the way I handled it. That would have been a written evidence for him to fall back on. Now, when the same person accuses him of sexual advancements at the price of, covering up her sin or whatever, her indiscretion in using the company's funds. Clearly that that employee has a problem with sticky fingers or not managing their personal money accounts well. And anytime they're dipping into company funds to pay off people, they're stealing. It's just another way of stealing. So that person has issues. Having said that, though, I think if the supervisor who helped her in the first place, if that person has always operated in an honest way and above board, I think his managers, his superiors should understand what he tried to do and should not be lured by that employee accusing him of sexual harassment, because clearly she has set up a kind of pattern for herself. This would be the second time that she was caught stealing, so that should mean something to those involved. And the supervisor who she lied on, he still has the choice to forgive her, but forgiveness does not equal, again, restoring her to her former position, which is what he did in the first instance when he paid the loan for her and allowed her to continue as the cashier. I think even from that first offense, the way that she was managed ought to have changed. We've all heard of scenarios and they sound quite good and they look, they're quite hard moving in movies and so on, when a person may put a thief to be in charge of monies. We've heard of the priest who forgave a guy who stole the silver plates from the rectory or whatever it was. He forgave him and he employed him as, a person to look after the silver plates or the treasures of the rectory. And it looks good, it sounds good in a movie, but that is not usually the case. People who have a problem stealing, unless that problem is dealt with, will continue to steal, and we must recognize that. And therefore, that problem should have been addressed. It should have been properly recorded. He could have chosen not to fire the person, but put them in a different, position to work or whatever. But the mere fact that he got caught twice, again, twice, trying to help this person with the same problem, and now the person turned around and accused him of sexual harassment, It reminds me of Joseph in Potiphar's house. You know how Potiphar's wife made the advances towards Joseph and then accused Joseph once she was rebuffed. And you see a lot of this happening in workplaces today. So one has to be careful. But the question is whether, what should he do in terms of forgiveness? I think he could forgive her still, but forgiveness does not equal restoration and restoration and restoration multiple times. That person has a problem, and that problem has to be dealt with.
Thank you very much. So we are going to summarize in about 15 seconds per panelist. Final thoughts on forgiveness. We have 2 more scenarios, but we would like to end our live broadcast. Thank you for those who joined us on YouTube this evening. We hope that you were blessed. We hope that you learned something about forgiveness and restoration and the choice that we have in forgiving the offender, about the part the offender has to play in the role of forgiveness, in empathy and in healing, etc. So I'm going to offer the panelists 15 seconds to speak on forgiveness for final time, and then we're going to end the live broadcast and pose 2 more scenarios to you.
I'll opt to go first, and I'll say this, very simply put, forgiveness is a choice, but it is, for me, a necessary choice. Because Jesus Christ has said to all of us who have, and all of us are offenders, right? We are born in sin, shaping in iniquity. He says, please forgive as I have forgiven you. So even though forgiveness is a choice, it is a necessary choice for us as Christians to choose to forgive. And remember that it liberates you.
This choice takes time, I will add. And we need to understand and appreciate that process, the humanity, the physiology of it, so that we respect that and understand that we all at some point will need forgiveness.
The